Thanks very much, Bobby. It's a pleasure to be here, pleasure to see so many of you here, and lots to talk about. So, a war in the middle of Europe of this sort was not expected. We have had wars in the middle of Europe. We had them in the former Yugoslavia, and they were pretty vicious in the 1990s. But this is of a scale and intensity and competitiveness, if you like, of a sort that we haven't seen for a long time. And of course it involves directly a major power, a nuclear power, and therefore it's raising issues all the time about the nature of international politics, the future European security order, as well as very specific questions about the conduct of war, how they're fought. And I just want to say a couple of words about expectations, and then why these expectations were not met. And there were a general expectation about Russia's strategy and approach to conflict that developed out of the 2014 annexation of Crimea and its fomenting of separatist movements in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, in the spring of 2014. And these expectations were around something that got misnamed as hybrid war. I mean, the idea of all wars are hybrid to a degree just means you're not just doing one thing, you're doing lots of things, and somehow you have to coordinate them. But the idea was that an incredibly important part of the Russian approach would involve cyber attacks, it would involve information campaigns, it would be a mixture of irregular and regular forces, and somehow these would all be coordinated to produce an overall sort of synergistic effect that would go beyond what each of the elements might achieve by themselves. And it didn't happen, so that's the first thing to note, didn't happen. There were cyber attacks on the eve of the war, right through the start. Actually, some of them ended up being directed against Russia, but they weren't decisive. And that's going to be one of the things people are going to be looking at. There were information campaigns, but they were flimsy, and we can talk about that. Putin, curiously, is not an upholder of the rule of law, but he believes in process. So there's a process that Russia has to go through before it invades anybody, which is to create a pretext of some sort. And this was done in that interval between the extraordinary Security Council meeting, which was televised on the 21st of February, and Putin's sort of rant that evening, and the actual start of the war, where a pretext was created in Luhansk, which didn't take very long to realize was just a put-up job. But that worked for Putin when he announced on the 24th of February he was going to war, that it would happen. So that's one of the set of questions. We haven't had this sort of across-the-board, multi-domain attack. It's been quite bitty and not at all well synchronized. And that leads to the sort of the major question, is that if you were engaged in these debates, as I was leading up to the 24th of February, the assumption was that there was no contest, that Russia would so outgun Ukraine that it wouldn't have a chance. And one of the major analysts, who to his credit changed his view very quickly, said on the 23rd, Russia can do almost anything it wants to with the military power that's been assembled. So why, when it came to the crunch, was the effect so limited? And there's a basic point about underestimating the Ukrainians. We talk about overestimating the Russians, but we also, as importantly, underestimated the Ukrainians, who've been thinking about this for a long time, who'd been making preparations, who had a system of mobilization, and had been getting in better weapons. I mean, I suspect many in this audience are not great fans of this government, but the fact is that the British moves before the war made an enormous difference, and as a country I think we should be proud of that. They provided some of the basic kit that was needed to support the defence. So the Ukrainians themselves were underestimated. That was important. But that was a reflection of an overall overestimation by the Russians of their own capabilities, and I would say a delusional view of the enemy they were facing. If you read Putin's famous essay, 7,000 word essay that he published in the summer of last year, as well as listened to his rant on the 21st of February, somebody said he's been reading too many history books. He's been trying to put together a story of Russo-Ukrainian relations which fits certain mythologies which are quite strong in Russia. He didn't originate these, but which really denies Ukraine its own identity, doesn't consider it to be a proper nation state, assumes that somehow it's been taken over by a bunch of neo-Nazis. And there's lots of debates about what he really means by this, given Zelensky's Jewish and so on. Nazi basically refers to any enemy of Russia. I mean, I think that's the best way to understand it, because as soon as somebody declares themselves to be against Russian policy, they're immediately labelled a Nazi. But that's bound up, which, as we've seen, is incredibly important in this setting, which is the cult of the Second World War, of the Great Patriotic War. For Putin, this has become, I think, the major mobilizing symbol for the nation. It infuses everything that is being done, which is why people were putting such a strong focus on the 9th of May victory parade, which turned out to be rather a damp squib, but that's one reason why it's been so important. So this mythology had been created about this non-country governed by Nazis who were in imposition on the people, who were persecuting the good Russian speakers in the Donbass. And so, of course, it led to a rather arrogant approach. And that's why it went wrong right from the start. First, it wasn't, the Ukrainian defences weren't taken seriously. And more importantly, those who were doing the offensive weren't prepared. They were given very little notice of what they were going to do, which is why you had all these stories of Russian soldiers thinking they were on exercises, being surprised by what they found. Local commanders didn't have a chance to develop their tactics, to think about what they were going to do. There were 4 different axes of advance, each with their own command structure, so almost 4 different wars, which again didn't help the synchronization. But most importantly, there was a dash to Kyiv to take Zelensky, which makes sense, I mean, in terms of the strategic objectives that Putin had set. But it failed, and it failed quite spectacularly. It was the first indication that things really were not going their way, and had tremendous implications, because the fact that Zelensky survived and then sort of was able to rally his people, become a presence on international television, show the strength of his background in acting. I mean, talking about comedian doesn't really capture Zelensky's strengths. He's a performer, and he knew how to perform the role, which he did very well. As soon as Ukraine showed resilience, then you knew the Russian occupation was going to be in trouble, because essentially the problem, which is why I, amongst others, was skeptical that this would ever happen, was you can't occupy a hostile nation of 44 million people in a territory a bit larger than France, with the number of troops he had. Even with a lot more troops, you can't do it. I mean, it's a basic lesson that we've learned painfully, and that you would have thought he might have noticed as well. So as soon as you saw Ukrainian resistance, popular resistance, then you knew at one level this war was going to fail. not necessarily on the battlefield, but you knew it was going to fail in its ultimate objectives, even if it ended up with an insurgency and popular resistance. It was going to fail. I think the surprise was we never even got to that stage, that the conventional stage failed so spectacularly that Russia had to withdraw after a month of war and refocus its efforts on the east and south and give up on the capital Kiev, which immediately made the long-term prospect for what the Russians could achieve much more parlous. I've given some of the reasons why: arrogance, not appreciating why the Ukrainians might fight as well as they did. It's quite interesting. I think there's a problem. I mean, generally most military analysis comes from the United States. It's a great power. It's offensive-minded. It thinks in terms of offensives too. It doesn't think enough in terms of defenses. And I think they were quite surprised by the tactics that we used. But I think the biggest surprise was the failure of the Russians to use what was assumed to be a substantial superiority in air power. If you look at the wars that the Americans have fought, and they by and large win on the conventional side, they may not do so well in the insurgency, but they win before you get to an insurgency. It's air power. It's air power that does it. It's air power that did it for Russia in Syria. They fought an air power war, but that may have seemed too easy to them. They didn't face serious air defences in Syria. So the Russian Air Force barely turned up. The Ukrainian Air Force is still flying. And the problem for the Russians is they appear to have run out of precision-guided weapons, which means that they've got to fly at quite low altitudes to hit anything of significance. And of course, they're vulnerable to portable air defense systems, of which the Ukrainians are getting more. So that, I think, was absolutely critical. And then they had to use the Ukrainian road network. So you've seen all these columns, but they were just picked off. They didn't follow their own doctrine of combined arms, so tanks were just left alone. They're still being left alone on roads where they can be picked off by anti-tank weapons and now more artillery. And their communications network went down, so they don't have secure communications. They had to use the Ukrainian telephone network, which meant why you've got so many audios coming out of conversations between Russian soldiers and their mums back home. So all of these reasons led to a really significant failure. Since they announced on the 25th of March that they were going to focus on the Donbass, that really got going about a month ago. It's a really tough fight. I mean, I don't think one should... we know a lot about Russian losses. We don't know as much about Ukrainian losses, but they're severe. I mean, certainly in terms of personnel. It is a tough fight. But as we saw with Mariupol, and we're seeing now where the fighting is going on, it's taking the Russians an awful lot of time and effort and energy and weapons and people to take not very much. So where are we at the moment? It seems to me that the Russians initially, if you remember those maps with all these great big red arrows circling round, initially those big red arrows were going to cut off what's called a joint forces operation, which is the main Ukrainian force, a high-quality force that was based there precisely because of the separatist enclaves in the Donbass. There's a very substantial force. The idea was that this would be cut off and destroyed. And that required at least two separate offensives and then meeting up in the middle. And gradually you can see how this was going to be done receding. They just can't do that anymore. What they now appear to be doing is to try to take Luhansk, and they're making some progress on that. There's a couple of cities in the way, so that seems to be really the focus of the main effort. So instead of trying a sort of great envelopment maneuver, they're just putting hard force into one particular place. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have had one successful counter-offensive in Kharkiv, the second biggest city, and that seems to have pushed the Russians largely away. They're nibbling away on the other side against Kherson, which is a city that was taken without much trouble by the Russians early on, and the Ukrainians are sort of moving towards there. There's some indications of what I suppose one could call partisan warfare taking place behind Russian lines now. The Russians have got a real problem. They're not beat yet, but they have a real problem. The UK Ministry of Defence has estimated about a third of the original combat force has been lost, killed, wounded, equipment destroyed, abandoned, or whatever. And that fits in with visual evidence that this is a very transparent war. So that fits in with what's been corroborated. That's a heck of a lot to lose. It really is. And you can argue it's a testament to the sort of stoicism of the Russian army that they're still going. Other armies would not be still going at that stage. So they're out of manpower. They're struggling to get reserves in, and that's a real problem for them. So over time, if the attrition continues, the Ukrainians are going to be in a stronger position for two reasons. First, they've mobilized. The Russians haven't mobilized. Putin is nervous about doing that. And even if he did, it would take time to get reservists and conscripts into the battle. Ukraine's mobilized. Manpower shortages are not the issue. The manpower losses are painful, but that's not the issue. Secondly, they're getting really good equipment in now. The artillery that's coming in from the US, hopefully soon from France as well, means that they outgun the Russians in some key battles. My assumption is that the Russians will try quite hard for the next couple of weeks to see what they can do. But gradually, I think the Ukrainians hope to move to the offensive. And then we'll see. It's a very different sort of battle. It's a different sort of challenge. There's a lot of territory to overcome. But the momentum may be with them. And one of the issues for me, which centers a social sciencey point, is the sociology of an armed force. It's very hard to motivate people when they're going backwards. And when they've seen such tremendous losses amongst their comrades. A lot of the chatter that's being picked up and reported reflects an unwillingness of soldiers to take great risks or to join up. So it's a really interesting question about how much the Russian forces can really withstand a serious offensive. We can't underestimate them because we know how they fought in the past, but you just have to keep that in mind. At some point, and you can see this starting to happen, diplomacy will start to rear its head, and questions are going to be asked about whether or not there's a way of bringing this to a reasonably quick conclusion, limiting the amount of bloodshed. I'm skeptical. I think the way that the Russians waged this war, the brutality with which they did it, has told against them in the end, because it's motivated the Ukrainians, motivated the international community. But, you know, for the Ukrainians themselves, a ceasefire that saw the Russians withdraw would be tempting. A ceasefire which held the lines where they happen to be at the moment, not tempting. Zelensky has said he'd meet with Putin, person to person. I can't imagine anything Putin would hate more. because he would have to acknowledge Zelensky as the legitimate leader of a sovereign country, which is what he was trying to deny. So that's something that we have to watch. Other issues which, in a post I did yesterday, tried to highlight the importance of the Black Sea. Ukraine is a really important agricultural exporter. There's food inflation is as bad as energy inflation at the moment. A number of developing countries, not just developing countries, are being hit quite badly now. Ukraine is a major exporter, and its exports go out through Odessa and the Black Sea. How this problem is solved is going to be pressing as well. So there's a lot of issues that are still out there. We seem to be approaching a quite pivotal point, at the point at which an essentially defensive battle by the Ukrainians could turn into something much more demanding and challenging. And as always, all we can do is watch as carefully as we can and see how it goes.